Alright, today we're talking trinkets in this video. I want this video to be fairly quick, so I'm going to kind of breeze through these. I want to show off the trinket and how they work, or at least talk about it if I haven't been able to test it in actual Mythic Plus content. And I'm going to try to show footage of gameplay on the board, or at least breakdowns of trinkets from dungeon runs or training dummies that I've been able to test these out on. There's a couple of caveats with this video though. I'm going to be talking about these trinkets from a Brewmaster POV. While it will bleed into other tanks, specifically leather-based tanks, we are one of the only tanks that doesn't like to stack haste. Actually, we generally ignore haste until Blizzard reworks us. So with that being said, there are some haste trinkets that are going to be very good for some tanks, but not good for Brewmaster, so keep that in mind. I'm also not going to be talking delve trinkets. Delve trinkets can never go above 6, like the hero track worth of item level. Plus, farming them on hero track is also very difficult because you need to have restored coffer keys for your delves. So it's just, it's not a, I don't like to kind of introduce that RNG into the equation unless you can actually like farm it. And delve, unfortunately, from my understanding, you cannot farm the hero gear from delves. So we're going to break this down into kind of 3 quick parts. We're going to talk specifically damage trinkets that you can utilize as a Brewmaster, but can't necessarily farm. You have to roll the Windwalker specialization, or I shouldn't say farm, but we're also going to talk about the raid trinkets, and then we're going to talk about the kind of more or less stat stick and or quote-unquote Brewmaster trinkets. So feel free to use the timeline below to skip around, but let's just dive into it. So starting off, we have Grim Codex and the Conductor's Wax Whistle from Theater of Pain and Dark Flame Cleft respectively. Now the Grim Codex is an on-use, and what it does is it conjures a spectral scythe in front of you, cleaving your primary target and all mobs behind that target. It's a 1.5 minute cooldown. It does pretty subpar damage. Is basically the best way I can summarize this. You're probably never going to want to utilize this unless they end up buffing it. So if you ever see this drop, you're probably free to disenchant it. Now, if you don't have any other damage trinket, it's not bad, but there's definitely better damage trinkets out there. If you're looking for something that's a little bit more of a stat stick and passive, the Conductor's Wax Whistle is actually not too bad. It does deal physical damage, which does scale a little bit with Mystic Touch. This is basically just a random proc, which has a minecart rolling in, dealing a good bit of burst damage. It's going to be similar output, maybe a little bit more than the Grim Codex over the course of a run or a course of a fight. But these are 2 trinkets that I don't necessarily recommend using unless you don't have anything better. Now, the other 2 good damage trinkets from dungeons, though, are actually going to include the Ravenous Honey Buzzer and the Charged Stormrook's Plume. So the Honey Buzzer is a little weird because basically you mount a mob, or you mount the trinket almost, and you charge through your targets. And this can be a little bit awkward to utilize because it's displacing your character. So if you're not comfortable using it, I don't necessarily recommend actually running it. But it does a good bit of damage competitive with any other damage trinket you're going to be able to actually get this season. So it's not bad. So if you want to see how it works, it looks a little something like this. I'm going to hit my trinket button. It's going to mount me up through the B, then it's going to charge through. And you can see here that it hit 2 targets for 1 mil each. So if you can get like a nice big clustered pull, it's actually going to do a fair bit of damage. Now, on the other hand, you have the this Charged Stormrook's Plume, and when you use this, it's actually going to have a slight distance to it, and it's going to charge your character to that location. So if I use it here, it's going to have a cast time. It's going to have me charge in, and it's going to do roughly about 700 to a 1.4 mil, depending on crits, to each target hit. Again, both okay damage trinkets, but the way that it displaces your characters, I'm not necessarily like the biggest fan of. But those are the dungeon trinkets that you're going to have access to. Now, all of these, I think you have to roll Windwalker for in the key. So if you are farming any of these keys and are looking for either of these trinkets, make sure you're in the Windwalker spec. All right, so let's talk about raid trinkets really quick. First off, I want to talk about House of Cards and Eye of Kezan. Now, these are kind of awkward because they come from very deep in the raid. You have House of Cards coming from the One-Armed Bandit, and you have Eye of Kezan coming from Gallywix. Now, I'm going to just say this. I don't think either of these trinkets are good for tanks. The Mastery stat stick on Eye of Kezan is just not super great, and the ramping main stat buff is really only going to be good for like very good chain pull dungeons and long boss fights. It takes give or take 4 to 4.5 minutes for this to ramp all the way up to 20 before you actually start getting the damage from it, and even the damage is like relatively laughable. But having almost 10k main stat is going to be very strong. Again, it takes a very long time to actually ramp this up, so just not a great trinket. There are a few dungeons where you can chain pull pretty aggressively in. Cinderbrew Meadery is one of those dungeons. You also have Priory of the Sacred Flame, a very good chain pull dungeon where you can maintain stacks for a long time. And then you have the Motherlode. If you're not running either of these 3 dungeons, I don't think the Trinket's going to be all that great. So I don't think it's worth running. Now, the other trinket is House of Cards. Now, this trinket is an on-use on a 1.5 minute cooldown, so it could line up actually pretty well with Weapons of Order, and it has a chance to give you 8 to 10k mastery. Now, this just gave me 9.7, which is a very sizable mastery buff. So it's not like the worst trinket to run. You can pair it with Weapons of Order, you can pair it with kind of like big chi burst damage. You can use it a little bit for survivability on things like Celestial Brew. Mastery scales attack power, and attack power affects our modifier on Celestial Brew, so it's okay for that. But generally speaking, I think it's a pretty lackluster trinket for the most part. And since it's very competitive for most DPS specializations and maybe even healers, you're probably just not going to be able to get your hands on it for the majority of the season, so I don't necessarily even recommend going for it. Next, let's talk about the Reverb Radio and Scrapfield 9000. These are both like haste-based trinkets. Reverb Radio is going to be very good for most tanks. It's just not going to be good for Brewmaster. The way that this works is your attacks have a chance to give you haste, about 300 to 400 haste. As you can see, almost my first attack gave me 300. I got another 300 there, so I'm already at 2 stacks. I'm now at 3 stacks. Basically, the uptime on this trinket is very, very high because it procs very frequently. And then once you hit 5 stacks, it's going to double the value of this buff for 15 seconds, and then it's going to reset. So basically, it gives you a small ramping haste buff, and then it doubles. So yeah, it's good for pretty much 5 of the 6 tanks outside of Brewmaster. So we're not going to be running it, but most tanks are. Now, Scrapfield 9000 is interesting because what it does is it gives you this buff, Imminent Overload. And if you drop below 60% health, this gets removed, and it gives you an Absorb Shield that has a 50% DR attached to it. That's great. But it ends up being very weak compared to most tank trinkets. But if it expires and you don't end up actually proccing it, it gives you 3000 haste instead. So again, a very good trinket for most tanks. For Brewmaster specifically, we're not going to benefit from the haste, and the Absorb Shield is not large enough compared to other tank trinkets that are out there. So I don't think this trinket's going to actually end up being good for Brewmaster. Again, if you have it and you don't have any other good option, it's not a bad trinket. It's just not what I would consider our best trinket. So right now I would say Reverb Radio, House of Cards, and Eye of Kezan are probably in like that C tier. And then we have Scrapfield 9000 in like a B tier slot. Next, we have Vexy's Pit Whistle and Combustible Bomb Suit. Now, I like both of these trinkets a lot for a couple of reasons. First, Vexy's Pit Whistle drops off of the first boss, so it's very easily accessible, especially pugging Mythic. The first boss is generally very easy to do. This is a tank-specific trinket as well, so getting your hands on it should be easy as long as people aren't rolling like off-spec on it. And it does some cool stuff. So basically, it summons a little minion, and that minion is going to coat enemies in oil for 5 seconds, and then it's going to explode, dealing high amount of fire damage. And it does additional damage to any enemy affected by that oil. What it also does is it actually gives you threat. Unlike most minion trinkets or minions in the game, like pets generally have their own threat table, but this guy is going to basically tricks you. So it's kind of interesting to actually use this. Now, it can't oil up every single mob that's in a poll, especially if you're pulling more than 5 targets, but it generally will do a good bit of damage here. So let's see what it can do on 3 targets. So as you can see, once I use it, you're going to see this little guy. He's going to just start, spraying these guys in oil. You're going to see this oil debuff, and he's going to explode, dealing very sizable damage. Now, he crit twice, but he only hit 2 targets, and it did 4.3 million damage. And again, this is a 1.5 minute cooldown. So I would say out of all the damage trinkets you could possibly have, this is probably one of your better choices. So I'm going to put this in kind of like a B or A tier, I guess. Maybe we'll do that. And then lastly, we have Combustible Bomb Suit. Combustible Bomb Suit, if you haven't been paying attention to the PTR, is kind of like the most broken trinket right now. Now, I don't think it's the best for Brewmaster, or maybe not the best in all situations. First, it's a haste stat stick. We don't like haste. But what it does is it rapidly deploys a massive 11 million damage Absorb Shield. And then what this does is it absorbs 75% of the damage you take for that 11 million for 20 seconds. Plus, once it expires or gets fully consumed, it'll explode. But the best part about this trinket is it gives you a transmog effect on your character. It gives you this really cool, rugged, cyberpunk looking thing with giant bombs that are glowing. Very cool trinket. Very sizable absorption shield. This actually, it scales with versatility, so Brewmaster monks actually really benefit from this. 16.5 million absorb, which is pretty much my entire health bar. This trinket's very broken. The only problem with this trinket right now is that it drops, dude. It drops from the final boss of the raid. So if you're prog raiding, if you're raiding with a very good raid team, good trinkets. If you can't, you're kind of shit out of luck. But I will say this, there is a very comparable, if not better trinket for Brewmaster monks from Mythic Plus. So I'm actually going to put this trinket into S tier if you can get your hands on it. If you can't, that's okay. Now, some of these other trinkets I'm going to categorize really quick. I think both of these damage trinkets are probably going to fall into like the C tier category. I'm trying to like organize this in my bag to give you guys more of a visualization. All right, that should make sense, right? So we have S tier, A tier, B tier, and then this is our C tier trinket category. All right, we have a few other trinkets that I want to talk about here. First, Remnant of Darkness. This comes from Dark Flame Cleft as well. This is, if anything, a D tier trinket. It procs very slow. The damage it does is laughable. It's only good once you have more than 50% of the stacks accumulated, and then once you hit the 5 stack mark, it literally just blows up and does damage. But that damage is, again, it's laughable, plus then you lose main stat, and it has no stats on the actual trinket itself. Not a good trinket for Brewmasters. Maybe it's C tier if you can't get anything better, but I would say like this is probably the last thing you want to run. Speaking of really bad trinkets that you never want to run, the modular platinum plating. This gives you 4 stacks of platinum plating for 30 seconds. Now, each of those stacks gives you 3,629 armor. So you're going to have give or take 14,000 armor from this trinket. It does scale with versatility, and it'll drop a stack whenever you take 10% of your max health in physical damage. Now, here's the problem with this trinket. My armor is already at 63,000, which is giving me a 27% DR, 27.5% DR. When I use this trinket, it's only bumping me up to a 31.8. It's giving me an additional 3% DR from physical attacks only. Very bad trinket. I don't know how else to explain this. I don't know why Blizzard keeps like bringing this back. We've seen Workshop now 3 times, and this is the 3rd time this trinket has returned. It's seen no changes. It should be an absorb. It should be way, way, way more armor from this. It should basically, I don't know. There's so many things they could do with this trinket, but they refuse to. So this is also a D tier trinket. Now let's talk about some ones that I'm not like super fond of, but are okay. Tome of Light Devotion is kind of interesting. What you do is you see this book that pops up, and basically as you're in combat, what it's going to do is it's going to increase your armor by a little bit. It's not a lot, but it's also going to give you a magical ward that absorbs damage. Now, when I was running this in a key, it ended up only being about 3% of my healing. Now, this depends on if you're taking a lot of magic damage or not. I don't know if I necessarily was taking as much magical as I was physical. So it ends up being about 3% of your healing and 3% of your damage. So I don't think this trinket is necessarily bad to run. The biggest problem that I have with it is that it's not giving you main stat. It also has a non-use effect, which just increases the effectiveness of the trinket for a short period of time. I would categorize this as more of like a C tier trinket though. If you have it and you have nothing else to use, again, it's fine, but I would try to replace this as quick as you can. Next, I do want to talk about Azerokk's Resonating Heart from the Motherlode, an improvised Seaforium pacemaker from the new dungeon, Operation Floodgate. Both of these are proc-based trinkets. The Seaforium one's very, very good for Brewmaster. Basically, right when you enter combat, you gain a buff that lasts for 15 seconds and gives you about 3,000 critical strike, but then your critical strikes following this proc will extend the buff upwards of an additional 15 seconds. So it's 50% uptime on 3,000 crit being a main stat stick. So this is actually a very good trinket for Brewmaster monks. I would categorize this as A tier. It's probably one of the best, if not the best stat stick trinket you're going to get your hands on this season. And then after that, it's going to fall off. And then once it has an internal now cooldown of 1 minute, but now we're about 30 seconds out. And as soon as we hit that 1 minute mark in combat, it should proc again and allowing us to extend another 15 seconds. So again, very good. Now, Azerokk's Resonating Heart, on the other hand, when it procs, it gives you 20,000 main stat, which is 20% increase on what we currently have. That is very sizable. It makes things like Exploding Keg and Chi Burst do sizable damage. Pretty good trinket. It's relatively low proc rate, but it's still very good when it lines up. It can also refresh occasionally, which is really cool. But as you can see, we have Seaforium Pacemaker up again. So you're going to see that the uptime for that trinket is actually going to be very, very high. So we've been in combat for a little over a minute, about a minute 15. You can see that we got one proc, about 19% uptime on our Azerokk's Resonating Heart, but we're seeing a massive uptime. It's going to peak out at 50% that we have on our Pacemaker. So I like both of these trinkets a lot. I think Resonating Heart is a little too inconsistent to be considered maybe really like meta, but a 20% main stat increase is actually very sizable. It's about a 4% increase on your stagger, and obviously a massive increase on your basically all of your modifiers for basically all of your abilities. So very good trinket overall, in my opinion. I'm going to categorize both of these trinkets as A tier, with Seaforium and Pacemaker actually leaning into the category for S tier. Last but not least, actually not last but not least, we have a couple trinkets left. We have the Sigil of the Algari Concordance. This is also a kind of trinket you just can get on any class spec or role. And then we have Cinderbrew Stein. Now these both are proc-based trinkets. The Algari, Sigil of Algari Concordance is just a proc-based trinket that summons a little man that's going to help you like hit mobs in the face. It does a fair bit of damage when it procs, but the proc rate is fairly low on it. And then you have Cinderbrew Stein, which is just a proc-based trinket. It doesn't give main stat at all, but when it does proc, it gives you main stat. It gives a party member main stat, and it gives you a fairly sizable absorb, which shouldn't be scoffed at. Now, it used to be way better. They have nerfed it several times since its first inception back on the beta. In Season 1 at the very start, they had nerfed it again. So the healing from it is fairly low, but I still haven't seen it proc even, so we're just waiting for it to proc. And actually, we haven't seen the Concordance proc either. So I'm going to wait for those things to proc, and then I'll kind of talk about it. Oh, we got Cinderbrew Stein. So as you can see, it's a very small main stat proc, but the absorb ends up actually being a sizable amount of our healing. Not a bad trinket. It's probably a little bit too inconsistent for my liking. It literally have been in combat for 3 minutes and it hasn't procced yet. There he is. There's Boulderbane. He came up. He showed up. He's blasting. And so it's just dealing nature damage split to nearby enemies. So one proc of this trinket hit 12 times. It was doing AoE damage. I believe they have different procs. I'm going to have to actually do more testing on this, but basically, like, it's okay when it does proc. It does a lot of damage, but the proc rate is just like so low. I've had it proc back to back, but I've also had it not proc at all. Obviously, like over almost 4 minutes, it procced one time. So again, not a super great trinket. I'm probably going to just put it in the C tier, and it's only because of how inconsistent it actually procs for. Now, there is a world where you can like high roll, and it's for some reason it procs actually more often than it, not more often than it shouldn't, but you can basically high roll procs in a fight. Maybe for mythic, like in single target raid fights. So like there might be a world where this actually is like B tier, but I'm going to categorize it as C tier for now. And then in regards to the Cinderbrew Stein, I was in combat for about 4 minutes. I actually had okay uptime on it, 25%, but again, you're losing that amount of main stat. Now, what's cool about this trinket though is it can be utilized to help your like DPS or your healer, because it will proc main stat even more on another player. But again, for yourself, the healing is fairly minimal, and you're losing out on so much main stat. So I'm gonna put this in like B tier maybe, because again, it's still a pretty good heal. You're losing a lot of main stat for it. So that's kind of the big argument there. And all right, last but not least, we have the final two trinkets in our available arsenal. And that includes Signet of Priory and Ringing Ritual Mud. Now, one of these trinkets is extremely broken and the other one is just kind of okay. So Signet of the Priory is actually not bad if you're playing Master of Harmony and you're not playing something like Chi Surge, for example. It's actually going to line up with every single use of Weapons of Order, which actually might not be the worst thing in the world. Now, if you're playing Shado-pan, you're naturally going to have CDR on it, so then this trinket loses a little bit of value. So basically what Signet does is it increases your highest secondary stat by almost 8,000 at max item level on this mythic track, and it grants anyone else using this trinket, it also grants them that stat. So let's say your entire party is using this, you're also giving everyone else 200 verse. At least versatility is in my case, because verse is my highest stat. So when I use this, I'm going to go from 25% versatility all the way up to 34% versatility for 20 seconds. A very sizable buff if you're using like mastery or versus your highest stat. For the Brewmaster specifically, I'm going to probably put this trinket in like a B tier or maybe like high C tier, only because I just don't think it's going to end up lining up with a lot of our abilities. Maybe actually I'm going to try to move everything up. I'm going to put this in B tier. I don't think it's going to be your like best trinket, but it's not also that bad. Like basically getting a free 5% DR for 20 seconds plus having just 10 or close to 10% more damage on use is actually not bad at all, especially if versatility is your highest stat. Now, if you're leaning more into like crit, or if you're another tank who leans more into like haste, for example, it could also be pretty good. If multiple people in your party are using this trinket, it obviously gains value. It's a sizable stat stick with a good on use, but the 2-minute cooldown is really what throws me here playing the Brewmaster. And last but not least, we now have Ringing Ritual Mud. Now, I think this is probably our best in slot trinket if you aren't raiding. That is a big caveat. Obviously, the bombshell or the bomb suit is extremely strong, but Ringing Ritual Mud has kind of a cool nuanced effect to it. So basically what it's going to do is instead of granting you a DR, it's actually just a flat absorb amount. So this is going to be 7 mil. Now it's at a significantly lower item level. Keep that in mind. This is 636 versus a 678, but it is very competitive with the bomb suit's overall healing. Now what's also unique about this trinket is while it is a 2-minute cooldown, periodic damage causes it to actually get cooldown reduction by 2 seconds. So every time you take a periodic tick of damage, not including stagger, it's going to reduce it. So it's very good for dungeons like Cinderbrew Meadery, where you're having bleeds constantly applied to you. This trinket becomes close to like a minute 15 cooldown. There's also kind of some cool stuff you can do in Theater of Pain, for example. There's like any poop on the ground technically counts as a periodic effect. So a Brewmaster who's playing smart can actually strategize and utilize ground effects, and knowing if it won't kill you or won't cause you to take any lethal damage, you can stand in effects on the ground and give yourself cooldown reduction to this trinket. It also, instead of giving haste like the bomb suit does, it gives you versatility as a stat stick, which is a much stronger stat for the Brewmaster monk. So if we press this trinket here, you're going to see that this absorb is pretty sizable. It also does pulsing AoE damage while we take damage, and it spawns the Swamp Man behind us, which is very, very sick. This is probably my favorite trinket out of all of them that are currently available. I'm going to put this in S tier, similar to our improvised Seaforium pacemaker and the bomb suit. Now, if you are someone who doesn't raid, your best 2 trinkets are going to come from the same dungeon, which is Operation Floodgate. A very fun dungeon, in my opinion, but both of them are going to come from here. One's coming from Swamp Face, and the other one is coming from the Demolition Duo. Now, obviously, in Mythic Plus, it's going to come from the end of the vault cache or chest, but basically, you can farm one dungeon and get both of your best in slot trinkets. Raid trinket being very strong for damage, as well as Azerokk's Resonating Heart. But this is kind of my list of trinkets that are going to be probably best for the Brewmaster. So we have your S tier trinkets up here in the upper right hand corner. You have your A tier trinkets, you have your B tier trinkets, and then you have your C/F tier trinkets, however you want to look at it. Anyways, that's the trinket breakdown for the next season. I hope that helped clarify maybe what you're going to be looking for or what you're not going to be looking for next season. But anyways, I hope you guys are all staying happy, healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next one. Peace.